Hey folks, welcome to the PreSocratics discussion. This is going to be the first part of chapter 3 in the reader. I should say PreSocratics lecture. And as you can tell from the name, PreSocratics, we're talking about people who came before Socrates, although it's a little bit misleading because some of them may have existed around the same time. But what that goes to show you is that the importance of Socrates to the Western tradition and to philosophy in general. So we'll talk about Socrates next time, along with Plato, who was his student. And we'll get to Aristotle. We'll finish up with Aristotle, the Greeks, kind of the three main folks who were most influential. But the pre-Socratics are very interesting, and they got the ball rolling with what we consider today Greek philosophy and Western philosophy in general. And we'll talk about some of the cultural differences because we talked last time about ancient Chinese philosophy, and that's about, over 2,000 years ago in the time of, in the place, I should say, of China and Southeast Asia, as we know today. Now we're looking about in that same time period, roughly 500 or 600 years before the time of Christ, depending on the person we're talking about. But now we're going to the Western world, so this is the world that is the foundation of where we live today. In spirit, in intellect, in culture, in values. So anyways, I hope you'll see that connection between the past and the present here. So, and I'll help you see it. So let's look at the ideas we're going to talk about. The pre-Socratics, again, I'll give you some names in a bit, but they're just a collection of thinkers who existed in ancient Greece, and we're sort of turning away from mythology and towards reason, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the ideas that they talked about that are still with us today, the first one is called the Logos, and it's not logos, like logos are little designs, right, in our common terminology. That's not what it is. The Logos is a Greek term. They can actually refer to many different things. It's a dynamic word that has a lot of different meanings. Speech, discourse, conversation, debate are just a few of them. But the ancient Greeks actually saw the Logos, at least some of them, as more of a metaphysical force, kind of similar to the Tao, some sort of an ordering, intelligent principle in the universe. And as you'll see in the reader, the first Bibles were written in Greek because it was in the Greek world that Christianity developed. And so some of the translations they actually used the word logos for God in some of the first Greek Bibles. So this word logos has a much deeper, stronger implication than you might think. It's not just some, weird old abstract term from the ancient Greeks. it is that. But it also had a great influence, including right down to our, major religions of the day. So the logos, we'll talk more about that. The ancient Greeks also were some of the first they were the first that we know of, that we have a record of in the Western world, to think of this idea of atoms. And we take atoms for granted today, that we have atoms, right? I'm constructed of these small, we call them the building blocks of matter. Scientists have detected them in microscopes and so forth, and other devices. And it's not just me that's made of atoms, you are, the camera that I'm looking at is, and so forth. So atoms are everywhere, but it's important to remember that doesn't just come down to us from the gods. They had to think about it and say, well, how does the world work? How are things put together? And one of the theories they come up with is, well, maybe there's these small particles that kind of come together to form larger objects, but those small particles are the same. And so obviously the theory wasn't really proven until 1,000 or so years later in the scientific revolution, when we started discovering actual evidence of atoms. But the point is that they theorized about something that ended up being true. But what else happens when you start thinking of the world in terms of atoms, small particles that come together, is that if everything's made of atoms, it raises the question, and it all sort of, moves according. If everything is made of atoms, and all of those atoms are just kind of bouncing around according to scientific laws and norms of the world, we might call the laws of physics, where's the freedom in that? If everything's composed of these small particles that are observing and behaving according to laws that are, sort of concrete and can't be changed, objective laws of the universe, where's the freedom? So in other words, we generally don't think that something like this coffee cup has any freedom, and it's just a thing, but we tend to think of ourselves as having freedom because we seem more complex. But are we just a complex machine made of atoms? Aren't we just more complex than the cup? Are we really that different? So I hope you can see that what I'm pointing at here is the next major idea listed, which is determinism. And that's the claim that although it seems like we're free and we have free will, fundamentally we're not. Free will is an illusion that is created by our minds, but actually we are no more free than this cup is free, according to this theory. Now you probably have responses and counterarguments and thoughts like, well, no, I feel free, and we'll get there. And I address some of those in the reader. But anyways, the theory itself of determinism, it's important to see how that arises. Now later in the class we'll look at some other philosophies, and especially the philosophy of Stoicism, which is an ancient Roman philosophy that sort of takes determinism as a given. It's founded upon a view of determinism. And they also make use of the logos. So anyways, we'll get there. Last couple ideas I'll mention here, and now this section is called the PreSocratics, but I also address another group of people known as the Sophists. And it's important to note that when we look back historically at these periods of time and we use these kind of general labels like pre-Socratic, it's referring to a set of people who had a similar goal, and they were philosophizing in a similar way. But each of them was unique with their own unique history and past and culture and differences from one another, differences of opinion. So in a way it doesn't do justice to the great diversity of belief and opinion that existed back there when we just say, oh, the pre-Socratics. And when I do the same thing with this other group of people called the Sophists, it's a similar thing. It kind of sounds like, well, there were just these group of people who all felt the same. Not quite. They had subtle differences of opinion, even if they had a general agreement on some core principles. Sophists were a little different than pre-Socratics. They were more known to be orators. We have a word in our culture now, sophistry, that means basically bullshit. And the reason for that is sophists got a bad reputation for just sort of speaking up, literally standing up on top of soapboxes and preaching to people, sometimes charging money. But they had a reputation for just being really good with words, but not actually knowing anything. Like they could, twist any argument to make themselves sound right, but they weren't actually right. They didn't really have anything they believed in. So anyways, we'll talk about them. The reason I mention that is that sophists were what is called relativists. And there's no doubt, I'm sure, you've thought of this position, if you don't agree with it yourself. Relativism is just very simply and broadly the view that something is relative to something else. Now it's important to understand the implication of calling something relative. Calling something relative means it's only true or right in relation to another thing. It's not objectively or inherently true or right. So for instance, most of us would say that the laws of physics are not relative. They are objective because they are true regardless of, they don't depend on somebody believing them. They're either true or not. Somebody can say, I don't believe in gravity, but they would be wrong, right, according to this view. So most of us would say that that is not a relative belief. On the other hand, moral beliefs are often said to be relative, especially when we observe the different behaviors from culture to culture. The way different people eat, they favor some animals and not others, and there are different norms. However, the counter to relativism that many have pointed out today is that there's actually a lot of shared belief between culture too. So the worst thing you can do with relativism is to assume that you have the easy answer. And sometimes when students first encounter this, myself included, and I'll totally admit I did this as a student, I thought it was simple. Well, of course everything's relative, right? Of course it's all relative. And there's a lot of evidence reasons to believe that, because there's a lot of people going on spouting, sophistry, bullshit, and it's easy to see that. But when you think through it a little more deeply, it becomes clear that relativism is not a fact, as some people seem to think. It's an argument. It is a hypothesis. So anyways, we'll talk more about that. And actually, one way that a famous sophist named Protagoras, who's mentioned in the Reader, one way that Protagoras resolved the problem of relativism, because the problem of relativism, well, if it's just everyone's opinion, that how do we ever find truth? How do we ever, cut down and find anything that's universally true if everything's a matter of opinion? Well, basically what Protagoras did was he said, let's just embrace relativism. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's too hard to really argue against, so things are probably relative. He said, let's just assume they are, and let's just be practical. So that's what pragmatism is. It's kind of just going with the flow, because it's easier to get by in your life than to constantly go against the grain. Now, right away, you can probably see an issue with that, because what if Martin Luther King Jr. had been a pragmatist, let's say, who we talked about in the ancient Chinese philosophy section? What if he had been a pragmatist and said, well, I just need to go with the flow, the buses are segregated, we should just keep it that way, right? So you can see there's some issues with pragmatism, even if it does have some immediate value. So anyways, that's what we're going to be looking at. Brief historical context. So we talked about in ancient China that they were turning away from the worship of spirits to a focus on human nature. And in ancient Greece, they are similarly turning away from the worship of what we now call mythology, spirits, gods, and so forth. Forces that control, supernatural forces, metaphysical forces. They're turning away from that, and they're turning to reason. So in other words, instead of, to just use a crude example, instead of saying, well, the cause of that lightning bolt hitting the tree was Zeus throwing a lightning bolt. The god Zeus is the top of their pantheon of gods, their polytheistic system. Somebody might say, well, Zeus threw a lightning bolt. And the PreSocratics would actually say, no, I don't think so. We didn't observe that. We didn't observe Zeus, and we saw a lightning bolt. They would instead want to explain what in the sky, in the clouds, caused lightning to form and then led to the tree collapsing, or led the lightning to hit the tree. So in other words, like I said, they were considered the first scientists. They were turning away from mythological explanations for why things happened to physical explanations, to observing the universe around them. No, this is why this happened. This was connected to that, and here. And to be fair, some of what they said was pretty crazy and ridiculous, but keep in mind, we're talking about almost 3,000 years ago, a long time ago, a time when they didn't have Wikipedia, right? They're stabbing in the dark here at coming up with the first rational explanations of our world. Now, a lot of people point to why were they able to do this? Why was ancient Greece unique like this? Well, first of all, there were definitely other cultures that had some amazing philosophies around this time. We already talked about China, so I'm not sure that Greece is unique, but certainly what's often cited as a reason for them being more advanced in this way at the time is the climate of free speech. So as you probably learned in high school, ancient Greece is often seen as one of the first democracies. And it wasn't perfect. It was only a small percentage of the population that was in the democracy, typically the elites, and women did still not have the same rights as men. They still owned slaves. So it wasn't a perfect society, but relative to every other society there at the time, they had they were going in the right direction, many would argue. And they at least had the sense of democracy, that the people should have a say in how government is run. Every other place around was pretty much a theocracy, meaning that you worshipped the king and he was connected to the gods somehow. So anyways, this climate likely was largely responsible for allowing people to speak their mind and allowing the PreSocratics to say, hey, I want to figure out how these things work. Because if everybody thinks, if everybody's looking up to the kings and the gods and you say, well, I think this is explained differently than the gods. I think the explanation for this event is not the gods, it's some natural cause. That could get you executed, right? Because it's blasphemy if you're going against the gods. So the fact that that was removed for at least some people in Greece, ancient Greece, so that they could just speak their mind, I think led to a lot of this, many would argue. Now, we have still standing structures from that time, and it's pretty incredible. I don't know if you're as amazed as I am, and many historians and archaeologists are, at these ancient structures and cities. The pyramids of Egypt have been there for over 5,000 years, and that's just incredible. The Parthenon, which you can see there in the images on the bottom of that PowerPoint, the real one is on the right. The Parthenon's been there for almost 3,000 years, and that's a long time too. And of course, many people have wondered what society would have been like back then. And thankfully, we have this great video game series called Assassin's Creed that I'm sure many of you have heard of if you haven't played it yourself. And they've recently come out with a game called Assassin's Creed Odyssey. And that picture on the bottom left is a picture from the game where they're trying to depict how the Parthenon, up on a hill called the Acropolis in ancient Greece, how that would have looked, how that would have been if you had lived back there. So I highly recommend playing this game, and you can really go through all of Athens and see the artist's conception of what it may have been like. And it's all based on historical fact, and they include historical landmarks in the game. So I couldn't recommend that more. So these are the PreSocratics. Like I said, it's kind of hard to pin these guys down. In terms of, I'm sorry, we can pin them down, we know what they believed, but what I meant to say is, just to call them PreSocratics doesn't do justice to what was probably a great, very intellectually diverse set of ideas and beliefs over a long period of time in the ancient Greek world. But anyways, the first known Western philosopher is Thales, and basically what you see here on the slide, and actually, first of all, let me mention that you do not have to memorize the names of the extra people that I add to the PowerPoints and talk about. In fact, even of the main thinkers on the assessments, you do not have to know the names and dates. You'll never be tested on that. The only thing you'll be tested on is like the theories associated with the main guys that I gave you. Like, for example, Aristotle is something called a naturalist, which we'll learn about later. You should know that Aristotle's a naturalist. In terms of the main people, but you'll notice that I'll sprinkle in other historical figures in my lectures just to add to and help you understand the main points. You don't have to know the names of all those extra figures or the dates, so I just want to make that clear. You don't have to know the names and dates of any of these guys on the slide. Just try to get the general point here that I'm making. And the general point is that these guys are debating abstract ideas for the first time. They're addressing how the world works with reason rather than with theology or gods. And so it seems really weird, but one of the questions they're asking is, well, what is the world composed of? What is the world made up of? How does it work? Like, what is the structure of reality? Because before, people would just say, well, just God made it, don't question it, right? It doesn't matter. And they said, no, but I want to know what it's created of. And so they came up with different answers. And Thales said, well, I think water is the building block of life, and we see it everywhere. We need it to survive. Animals need it to survive. Maybe on some level, the whole universe is made of water. And another guy, Pythagoras, which he's the famous theorem of Pythagoras guy, that you learn in math, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He was indeed a famous mathematician and philosopher. And his view was that everything was actually mathematical in origin, that everything could be explained by numbers. In other words, there's some beautiful, perfect equation out there that will explain everything. But then Democritus comes around and says, no, guys, I think everything's actually atoms, right? I think it's all composed of these small things that come together to form larger objects. And other people later advanced his theory, which is another aspect of the ancient Greeks, is that they were doing differently. They were listening to each other. They were listening to what the other person was arguing, and they were saying, okay, what you said here makes sense, what you said here doesn't make sense. They were having a rational, open exchange where they weren't getting personal, and they were listening and advancing each other's ideas. And this is exactly what science is today. So again, I want to keep calling attention to these guys as being the intellectual precursors, the intellectual beginners of our scientific method today. Now, they came up with some even more abstract stuff, too. Heraclitus is the one who, you may have even heard this phrase, it's kind of become a popular phrase. You can't step into the same river twice, or it's not possible to step into the same river. Now, he's making a point about chaos and change, that the world, every single moment in the world is different than the previous moment. So in other words, you can't, the instant you put your foot in that river, the water that you touched, it's long gone down the river. There's no way you can put your foot in that same exact configuration. So anyways, I'm not going to talk about all of these, but this is basically what these guys were doing. They had a climate of free speech. They're able to speak their mind, and they're thinking about, how does the universe work? Right? Some of the first people to do that. So just to put it simply into one slide, so you know what I'm saying here, this is what it was. It was the beginning of reason. In the first chapter, I taught you about fallacies and arguments and biases. This is the beginning of that. These guys, of course, didn't have a more robust conception of logic. That actually wouldn't come until with Aristotle. Aristotle is the father of logic, and we'll talk about him later, like I said. But they definitely still they were getting the ball rolling, like I said, on having open, rational debate. Now, there's a criticism here, though, because even scientists today, we today have the image, the stereotype of the cold, collected scientist in the lab coat with the clipboard, just observing from afar, being very, indifferent to what happens and just wanting to know how things work. And that was they were even back then criticized for this, because in order to think about abstract ideas, you got to have some free time, don't you? You can't be working a 9 to 5 all the time. So it involves kind of not being as practical. It involves a disassociation from the practical world, and so that was a criticism, and it's still a criticism today. To what degree is philosophical reflection useful? And I come down that it's useful somewhere in between. It shouldn't be over-relied on, but it's clearly valuable to abstract and think deeply. I mean, you think science isn't useful? So anyways. So what I meant there was science isn't useful because science is an abstraction. Right? Science involves abstracting to stand back and understand the world, but it's also led to cures for diseases and, computers and technology. So anyways. Okay, so the logos. Like I said, the logos is this very dynamic Greek word that even back then had a lot of different meanings to different people. And as I point out in the book, it's actually the root term, the root word of words like psychology, sociology, right? The L-O-G-Y, the root is logos. So in other words, what's psychology? The study of the psyche. The logos part, its etymology is study. And the psyche is mind, the study of the mind. Sociology, the study of what's social, and so forth. Zoology and whatnot, and down the line. The L-O-G-Y, like I said, it's not just in spirit and culture that the Greeks have influenced us, but right down to our language. And it's the same in Spanish, right? Psicología and all those other terms that end with the logos part. It's the same thing at the end. So anyways, but for the ancient Greeks, especially some of the PreSocratics, they theorized about the logos in terms of not a god with a name. So this was it marked a difference in the way people were thinking about higher beings and higher powers. For most of the culture in their time, gods had names, Zeus, Athena, and so forth. And they had statues and they had identities. But what the PreSocratics are talking about is some general principle or force, like I said, more comparable to the Tao that exists around and is in everything. And so their version of the logos would also, like the Tao, be a version of pantheism. Remember, I defined that term last time, the idea that God is in everything. There's a force in everything. And the PreSocratics, at least some of them, seem to have seen it that way, that there is this force in all things. They also claimed that the logos has an internal logic, meaning that there's something that is driving it to do what it does. There's some internal force that's pushing the logos to create me as I am, and to create the cup as it is, and you as you are, and so forth. So that raises the question of, well, what is this internal logic? How does it work? How does the logos express itself? And this is why Democritus comes up with the idea of atoms. Because he says, well, the logos, the way the universe expresses itself is that there's these small particles. Again, small particles that come together in unique ways to form larger objects. So all the larger objects they form are different. I'm different than you, but we're made of the same stuff. The atoms themselves are the same. Just like Legos look the same, to some degree when you take apart the building or whatever it is you have, the ship or, the fire station, whatever it is you're building out of Legos, a lot of the pieces look the same, but when you put them together, they create this unique shape. That's more or less the argument that was being made by Democritus. He said, this is what explains why things are different, why things appear to be different. They appear different, but in reality, we share the same fundamental building blocks. People, chairs, everything else is fundamentally composed of atoms. And so this was the theory. And it was not just Democritus, but a few other PreSocratics advanced it as well. And of course, like I mentioned, what it leads to is what's become an enduring debate that goes on to this day, and new scientific evidence has come in on this in the last several thousand years. And that debate is on whether or not we humans are free if we're constructed of atoms too. And so, of course, this is the determinism debate. Now, let me just point out one other thing before we get there. So atoms, although the Greeks were right that their atoms existed, they didn't have evidence for them. And it wasn't until, like I said, scientists later discovered that evidence that they found, oh yeah, there are these little particles that, these things that we're going to call atoms, because it's true, there are these things that come together to form larger objects. So that was correct. However, and this, I'm trying to illustrate the way the scientific method works and the way the ancient Greeks started it. The Greeks actually, the term atom means indivisible in Greek. And so atoms, they believed that atoms were not divisible any further. They thought atoms were the lowest, deepest point you could get into reality, and you could not explain anything deeper. The ancient Greeks thought this, which is why they called them atoms, indivisible things. However, what we have discovered, as you can see in this image, and as I'm sure you already know or learned in high school or somewhere, atoms can be divided. And we're actually still trying to divide atoms further and to figure out how they work. The division of an atom ultimately, of course, leading to things like the atom bomb and many other technologies. But the Greeks were wrong about that, but they were right that atoms existed in some general form. So we can see, again, the way they got the ball rolling on some of the foundations of our culture today. But back to determinism. So determinism basically says that if everything's made of atoms in the world, it can be predicted in principle, and that this includes humans. So we can all be predicted in principle. Now you might say, and the reason I have the roulette wheel there is you might say, yeah, but aren't some things just random events that nobody has any idea what's going to happen, that nobody can predict? I mean, if we could do this, wouldn't we be wouldn't somebody be rich and making money in Vegas and so forth? Well, the answer to that, the determinist says, is we will get there. We just don't have the technology yet. So the determinist says, in principle, things can be predicted. And that's not purely a matter of faith. Some people see that as faith, that a determinist believes that we will be able to predict stuff. It's not purely faith, it's based on evidence, because we've seen that in the past we used to not understand things, and we used to think they were intractable, problems that couldn't be solved. And now we understand them, and there's a very clear causal relationship. I mean, you can see this with medicine, with the way we went from thinking that being sick was a cause of witchcraft, to being sick being caused by germs and so forth. So there's a number of ways that in the past we've predicted how something works, and then we've responded in the future based on our scientific understanding. So if that's the case, then who's to say that there won't be a future from now where we will be able to predict everything that today seems like we can't understand? So a determinist is not fazed by that counterargument. They say, yeah, there's a lot of randomness, but if we knew all the variables and we had the technology, we could still predict it. So think about the roulette wheel, which I have a picture of there, right? That seemingly perfect mesh of unpredictability. And yet, if you could know the exact angle and trajectory of, that the ball was going to come off the dealer's hand and be dropped into the wheel, the exact momentum of the wheel and so forth, and the velocity of the ball, I think you can see what I'm getting at. If you could have a device that could fully predict all those variables, you would know exactly where that ball was going to land by knowing all those prior conditions. So it's not a counter-argument to the determinist to say that. Now, the determinist argument, which I'm going to pull up here in a minute, is in the course reader. And again, I don't give page numbers here because the page numbers change, but it's in the section on determinism in chapter 3. And the argument is this. It's a very simple argument. The first premise, remember, an argument is a series of logic, a series of premises that are relevantly connected to each other. It's more than just an opinion. It includes a justification for what one believes, premises, and a conclusion, as we learned about in chapter 1. So now our task when we look at an argument is to think about, is it justified? Do the premises really support the conclusion? Are the premises true? Can we challenge them? So let's think about the argument for a minute, and then let's think about what sort of challenge we could mount against it. So the argument is, first premise, the physical world is determined by the past and the laws of nature. So let's unpack that for a minute. Now, I'm modernizing the argument. We're jumping forward from the PreSocratics a bit. I'm giving you a more modern understanding of an argument that was started by the PreSocratics. So the argument is, first premise, the physical world is determined by the past and laws of nature. What is that referring to? Well, the past refers to basically the Big Bang, or whether God started it, or there was no God, or the Big Bang happened, or whatever. There was some event that led to what's happening now. So it's actually irrelevant to the argument whether God exists. Either God started it, or the Big Bang started it, and there was nothing. It doesn't matter. Something started it, and here we are. Right? Or nothing started it, but it started, and here we are. That's the point. There's a past series of causes leading to where we are in the present. That's the point of that part of the premise. Now, the laws of nature just refers to all the observable laws through which matter must pass through which matter must pass. So gravity and Newton's laws of motion and so forth. Those are the laws of physics. Now, the PreSocratics didn't have that terminology. They hadn't understood all this yet. So they just talked about it in terms of atoms bumping around according to that logic, that internal logic. But now we have a more specific definition of that internal logic. And those are the laws of nature. So basically that first premise is saying that everything that happens now, all of the physical world we observe, including ourselves and everything in it, is a result of a whole bunch of causes from the beginning of time, the beginning of of matter, guided by the laws of nature until we are now here in the present. So it's hard to deny that on some level there's some truth to this, regardless of who you are, right? And so we'll talk later actually about a view that some philosophers have taken on this issue that's called compatibilism. The idea that we are determined in a lot of ways, but that deterministic outlook of the universe, it's still compatible with free will. So in other words, we can still have some wiggle room in our behavior, even if we're ultimately determined by a lot of outside forces. And that's probably the general consensus amongst most philosophers and scientists too. However, there are many and more people who are starting to come out as full-on determinists. And one of the reasons for that is there's some studies by a scientist named Benjamin Libet, who discovered that people in a laboratory environment, he was able to predict their decisions, like basic decisions, like choosing between like an apple and a pear or something. And he'd have participants in his studies. He'd ask them various questions, and but he would, when he was asking them questions, he had their brains wired in. I think it was an EKG or one of those devices that measures the brain waves and activity. And based on his knowledge and understanding of the brain, he was actually able to predict people's choices of very basic choices before they chose with a pretty high degree of accuracy. So that suggests we don't have free will, right? Because if people, here's the kicker: the people in the experiment, they thought they were making free choices. They were like, "Yeah, I chose this freely," and yet the scientist was able to predict their choices before they even made them. Doesn't that suggest that our brains are wired to make us think we have free will? Anyways, I'm not coming down on either side here, as I usually do not, but there is some interesting evidence pointing towards determinism that has recently come out, historically recently. So the second premise, though, is where people mainly disagree. Because the second premise says, because people might say, well, all right, yeah, the physical world is determined by these forces on some level. But once you throw humans in there, people start to say, well, but humans, we're not fully part of the physical world, are we? Right? Some of you are probably thinking, yeah, I have a physical body, you have hands and feet, and you have to eat food and so forth and get rid of it. But don't you have a soul? Right? Isn't the part of who you are that is a soul, isn't that non-physical? And so wouldn't that not be determined? Well, a couple things to say to that. The first one is that it depends what you mean by soul. There's actually no clear scientific evidence for a soul. Although lots of research yet still should be done. Also, it's very important to understand to define what we mean by a soul. But the second point is that even if there is some sort of a non-physical soul, it seems like, doesn't that just push the explanation up a step? Like, how do we explain that our soul is free, right? Where does the freedom of our soul come from? Aren't we being determined by our soul then? So in other words, if I say I don't have a soul and then I'm determined by the physical world, but then I say, oh no, but I do have a soul, so that takes away the determinism. But isn't the soul just another level of determinism? Whether I'm determined in my behavior by the physical world around me or by my soul, is there a difference? Right? I don't know. Maybe there is. I'm just throwing that out there, that some have criticized the soul argument for just not really addressing the question, because all it does is say that we're determined by our soul instead of by something else. So anyways, people disagree with that. Now, sometimes people bring in quantum physics here, and this really annoys a lot of scientists, because quantum physics is a highly specialized theory that was created really by scientists for other scientists, and they didn't intend it to have a lot of implications that people like, unfortunately, Deepak Chopra like to repeat. Now, I like Deepak Chopra in a lot of ways. I think he's a very happy, person who probably helps a lot of people, but he does sometimes speak of scientific terms in an inaccurate way. So quantum physics, let's think about that. What people typically say, who usually don't have a very good understanding of quantum physics, they argue that we're not determined because quantum physics shows that there's some level of uncertainty to reality as a whole. So, in other words, there's a famous experiment called the double slit experiment, and I'm not going to go into depth here, but it basically suggests that the way the experiment is run, the result of the experiment depends on the perspective of the experimenter. So if you look at it at a particular time, it looks like the light going through the slits comes out as a wave. If you look at it at another time, it looks like a particle. And in science, you want to be able to say, no, it's either one thing or the other. It can't be both. But the results of these experiments in quantum physics actually suggest that it's more complex, that it actually suggests that there isn't a clear answer. Yeah, that it is more complex. There isn't a clear answer at every time. Now, to be fair, it's still a highly predictive theory that has helped us build computers and more. But the theory, there's this degree of uncertainty there. And so some people use that to say, well, see, that means that there's uncertainty in our behavior. But the problem with that is the link between the way stuff happens at the quantum physical level and the way stuff happens at what's called Newtonian level. to put it simply, small stuff versus big stuff. So there may be some uncertainty at the level of small stuff, atoms and so forth, but we haven't really found that that translates to uncertainty at the level of big stuff. And guess what? We're at the level of big stuff. That's where our free will is supposed to exist, not at the level of atoms. So now I don't want to go too far here because there's still a long way to go in understanding the brain. There's still a long way to go in advancing our knowledge of how the brain works. And, for all we know, we could discover something about quantum physics and free will that, throws this into question. Or maybe we'll discover that we do have free will in some sense. So my point is that although quantum physics shouldn't be seen as direct evidence for free will, we don't know yet what it really shows about free will. And I think, being a little bit more open-minded and less stuck to any particular conclusion is probably the right path, in my opinion, at this point. Okay, so what else can I tell you about determinism before we move on? So I told you about the metaphysical part of determinism and the ways that all our behavior currently in the present moment may be determined. And by the way, that would include that even if I have the feeling of choice, like right now, it's like, I could talk about determinism or I could talk about something else. I have the feeling that I have a choice. But determinists would just say, yeah, but that feeling itself was a product of prior causes. That feeling itself was determined by previous causes. So just because you feel free, in other words, doesn't mean you are free. Let's not forget the appeal to emotion fallacy. The feeling of freedom doesn't guarantee freedom. After all, an ant in an ant farm that you control probably feels free from within. It can move around back and forth. But is the ant truly free? No. In a deep sense, no. So freedom isn't based upon one's feeling of it. So we should remember that too. But here's the moral part. So the moral part of free will is if we are determined and we have no choice in how we behave, well then, can we be praised and blamed for what we do? Right? This is the worry, that if determinism is true, if it's true that we have no free will in what we do, it would be hard to blame someone for doing something bad, wouldn't it? Because they couldn't have chosen otherwise. If somebody, if a dog eats something off the table, you might say, hey, bad Rover or whatever, but you don't get deeply mad at the dog because he doesn't understand any better. He couldn't really have done anything different. But with people, the reason we blame people is exactly because they could have done something different. That's the whole point. The whole reason we put them in jail. We say, you were a killer, other people went through similar circumstances, and they didn't kill. Other people suffered too, but you suffered and you killed. You chose to do it, right? That's typically the way we see it. But notice that if determinism is true, it's not, you can't make that same argument. You can't say that, oh, well, this person went through these similar circumstances and this one didn't kill and he did. Because for a determinist, those are two completely different people with two completely different histories, even if they're similar. Whatever led the person to kill, that was part of his specific causal process that led from, point A to point B. And whatever led that other person not to kill, likewise. So there's that as well. So you can't really blame people. And so this raises questions for our criminal justice system. Well, if we can't blame someone when they murder someone, what do we do? Some determinists respond here by saying, well, we still blame them in a practical sense. We lock them up because it prevents them from doing future things. But actually, there are some determinists who have argued that we should reform our criminal justice system to be more focused on compassion, because we often get very angry when we hear stories of somebody harming someone else and going to jail for it, but we often don't consider the way their circumstances or even biology may have led them to do that. Not only can we not blame people, if determinism is true, we cannot deeply blame them, but we can't praise them either, because in the same way that it's not your fault if you're a murderer, it's also not your fault if you're a great pianist or a great guitarist or a great speaker. Those are all things that you were just determined to do from birth and actually from the beginning of the universe. So determinism is basically saying, look, there's one possible future, it can't be any other way, It's just like when you put water in 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to turn into ice. It does not happen any differently. That's the way the universe is. In the same way, the present moment must be the way it is, based on the past and the laws of nature, and that are guiding it towards this one possible future. Right? So it may seem like there's other possibilities. It feels like I could raise my hand to the left instead of the right now. Could I have raised it to the right instead of the left? According to determinists, no. I was always going to do what I just did. I was always going to say the very things I'm saying now. The determinist says there's only one future, and it's happening exactly and only the way that it could happen. And your free will, the determinist argues, is merely an illusion in the whole process. So that's pretty much the essence of determinism. And like I said, we will come back to this idea later. Now, one thing I think that's interesting to think about here is that I would imagine most people who hear the argument for determinism are anti-determinism. And I would encourage you to think for yourself about, what do you think it would take to prove free will? What sort of evidence would you need to prove free will? Because remember, if you just say, hey, look, it feels like I'm free right now, obviously I'm free, that's not an argument, it's just an appeal to emotion. So what sort of evidence or argument could you use and point to that would suggest that we have some degree of free will? And that's just, food for thought for you. And free will, by the way, as noted in the reader, is typically defined by, you could have done otherwise. Right? I raised my hand to the left, but I could have raised it to the right. Whereas determinism is, you could have only done the thing you did, is one possible future. Free will is, you could have done something different. That's the basic definition. Okay, so moving beyond determinism, we will come back to it later in the class, as I mentioned before. So let's talk a bit about the Sophists before we wrap this up. And we need to talk about two other major ideas, but one is going to be the focus, and that's relativism. And like I said, this is a common idea that many of you probably already have come across if you don't believe it yourself. And this idea in ancient Greece was proliferated and raised by these people called Sophists, who again were these wandering teachers. They were often very annoying to people. They charged money for their teachings. They, like I said, they were accused of being what we would today call rhetoricians, or people who just spout off a bunch of rhetoric. Rhetoric is meaning just a lot of fancy sounding stuff without really having any substance to what they're saying. They're not really trying to help. They're just trying to win arguments. Kind of the anti-philosopher. A philosopher is supposed to be someone who has a discussion so you can learn and grow together. A sophist will have a discussion just to prove you wrong, right? That's the only point, is to win their argument. Sophists were the type of people who would go to one party and argue that chocolate is the best, and go right to another party the same day and argue that vanilla is the best. Right? They would just take a position, stand behind it, and just argue for it. Truth be damned. Right? Because and the reason is, as we'll see, they did not believe there was an objective truth. Now, they also annoyed Athenians because many of them came outside of Athens, and at the time, Athens was a great cultural center, and the Athenian citizens had a lot of pride in their people and their country. Just like in most countries, there's a lot of pride for the country. And so people were coming from outside trying to get rich off the Athenians, and many of them became sophists, and they would wow the Athenians with tales from other places, and they really annoyed the philosophers and the thinkers who were of Athenian origin. It's kind of similar to the way we have people coming to our country and coming to America and writing self-help books or whatever book and getting rich off Americans. Sometimes they get criticized for tapping into this American discontentment and sort of not being sincere and just being money makers, in other words. So there was that whole worry. But again, the reason why these guys could do what they did The reason why they were able to argue any point of view is because they didn't believe there was a point of view that was correct. So they thought, well, all that matters is that you're able to take a position and defend it. So let's talk then finally about this idea of relativism, because this is what these guys were. They were relativists. And as you can see from this PowerPoint, relativism basically denies that there's anything objectively true or objectively morally right outside of human opinion. So all we have are perspectives. Now, relativism can come in the form of individual perspective, in which case that's sometimes called subjectivism, meaning that the only thing that's right or true is based on a person's personal opinion. But relativism in terms of a society is often referred to as cultural or moral relativism, referring to the opinions of a group of people. So in other words, relativism is saying what is morally right or what is true is dependent only upon people, their opinion. So that's what is required for truth, is only a person's opinion, not outside evidence, not a good reason, not a direct observation, but a person's opinion. That's it. That's all it takes, according to relativism, to make something true or morally right. Now let's begin with truth. As I already talked about with truth, it's a little bit harder to make the argument that truth is relative because you're going to start to look pretty stupid, right? And you're going to run into the practical world real fast, right? So for example, if you say that, well, it's my opinion that scientists are just wrong and they don't really know what they're doing, and it's my opinion that sometimes everyday people get things more right than scientists do, right? Well, then what if I said, okay, well, how about I'm going to fly in an airplane built by scientists. You can fly in an airplane built by, some crackheads in a park who think they can build an airplane. Now, if you're a relativist, and I know that sounds ridiculous, and that's my point, is that if you're a true relativist, you have to say that those are both equal, right? A bunch of drug addicts in a park building some cardboard airplane, that's just as valuable, their idea is just as true, based on just as much truth as an engineer who has studied for years to know how to build an airplane, and the many other people who work on the airplane production process. I think I know which one I'm going to go with. So relativism, in other words, basically says that scientific truths are relative. That's the point I'm making here. Relativism says that science is just one other relative view. It's just one other point of view and perspective. Even though scientists claim to give us objective truth, say the relativists, they don't actually do that. It's just their version of truth. Now, to be fair, and we're not going to get into this in this class, but for those of you who are interested, there have been some very sophisticated arguments for relativism in science, and one I would point to is called the concept of paradigm shifts from a philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn. This is a very widely known and well-read book, and I highly recommend it. The book is called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So now Kuhn makes a particular argument that can be construed as relativism about science, but until you've read him, I don't think you should say science is relative, because it's going to make you look bad, right? You're going to run into that practical world. If you say, let's take a simple example. If I say that I believe there's a door here and I can walk out, and you say, well, no, I think the truth actually is that there's no door there and there's one here, you're going to walk into a wall, and I'm going to walk out of a door, right? So relativism seems to run into reality. If truth is relative, then it would seem to go against our perception of our everyday life, our everyday world. But with morality, it's a little different, isn't it? Because we all accept that, I shouldn't say we all, but most of us would accept that there are truths to the universe. There are truths like the laws of physics that I've been mentioning, that are universal. But it's harder to find moral laws like that, isn't it? It's harder to find evidence that there's a moral law that it's wrong to kill, say, everywhere, than it is to find a law that gravity always works in China and it works in Britain and it works in America, right? So it's hard to find universality in morality relative, versus finding universality in science, which is why moral relativism is more attractive than truth-related relativism. But even with moral relativism, there are some issues. So let's begin with the view that leads people to become moral relativists, the observation that leads to that conclusion. And the observation is this: it's that different cultures have different beliefs about right and wrong behavior. And I mentioned this at the beginning, but let's go into a little more depth here. So here in this image on the left, here in this PowerPoint, you see on the left some dogs in cages. Now those are dogs not to be taken home as pets, but to be taken home and eaten. This is in China. In some parts of China and other parts of Southeast Asia, they eat dogs in some parts of the cultures. In the middle there, that's a picture of guinea pig from Ecuador, where it is one of the staples and actually one of the national foods, and considered a delicacy, is guinea pig, roasted guinea pig. And then of course in America, we love our bacon. We love our pigs. Now, I hope you can see the point here, is that in one country, you have a norm where dogs are respected and loved and treated as pets, and we couldn't imagine ever killing them. And you have another country where they're treated as dinner, and in both countries they seem normal, right? So this supports the argument for relativism, because it suggests that, hey, these values, they change their truth, or they change what is considered good changes based on geographical location. You move over to China, it's wrong. It's okay to eat dog. You move over to America, it's not okay, right? And the same thing, of course, would be true with bacon, where you go to some countries that abhor, that hate, they couldn't imagine ever eating pork, and yet you come to America and that's on every menu, on every burger, right? Bacon's on everything. So this emphasizes that the observation that leads people to be relativists is this. We see the differences in cultures, and that leads us to think, well, there's no real, truth here. And it's a fair observation, and relativism is a fair argument to make based on what we see. So when I went to the Middle East, for instance, one of the things I noticed was I went to Jordan and Israel and Egypt, and especially when I was in the Islamic countries, what I noticed was men held hands. The men were holding hands when they were going out, partying, going out to have a good time. When they were out in the street, walking together, they were holding hands, many of them. And I later found out that this was a sign of friendship. Holding hands was a sign of friendship. Now, in the United States, can you imagine two jocks going down to the San Diego bars holding hands? That would have a very different meaning in our culture. So there's lots of these things we could point to, and I bet you all have examples. Maybe you inhabit two different cultures and you can see the way the norms differ. So there is something to relativism, and this is why it's such a long-lasting idea that people come up with again and again, because it's very clear to observe the world and to see the vast differences in belief and behavior. So that's relativism itself. Now, let's look at the positives and negatives of relativism. So relativism is good because it reminds us not to be culturally insensitive. Sometimes people wrongly assume their culture is better than other cultures, and this happens everywhere. It's not just Americans. We hear a lot about it in the United States, but there is racism and discrimination everywhere from the majority against the minority. Even though Christians in this country are the majority, for example, in countries where they're minorities, there are actually persecution against Christians, including in China. There are documented cases of discrimination. So people tend to assume their culture is the best. Americans do it. Many people in history have done it. Many people around the world do it. And in America, of course, one of the things you sometimes hear is speak English or go home, right? As though English is the only language that matters. And then sometimes you hear it from people like myself who are sometimes called elitists just because we're professors or we live in the academic world. And you might hear some of us say things, or imply things like this, that we're a little more informed and enlightened than the common people. Some would say this is partly what led to Trump being elected, is the sense that liberal elites thought they were better than the people in the middle of the country, thought they were smarter. And of course, this is emphasized with Hillary Clinton's deplorables comment. Now, I'm not coming down on either side there. I'm just pointing out that some would see it that way. And then, of course, with religion, it's obviously been like this for years. My religion's the right religion. And again, this isn't just Christians or just Muslims or just Buddhists. It's everyone can engage in these attitudes. So relativism reminds us that the beliefs we have and the culture we developed is one among many. And we should be humble about that and not and understand that there are other ways of thinking and other ways of perceiving the world. Right? So this is the value of relativism. However, this is the part that people don't often see, because relativism, like I said before, it's not a fact, it's an argument, it's a hypothesis, and it has implications. So this is one of the implications that people don't often see. So relativism, by definition, denies anything as universal. Right? So that means that relativism is actually going against our Constitution. Our Constitution says that people have inalienable rights, and this was something our founding fathers very much believed, that all people have inalienable human rights, universal. Everyone has them. According to them, you have a human right whether you're born in sub-Saharan Africa or Australia or Mexico or the United States. Everyone has those rights. But notice, it is very important to see this to understand fully what relativism is. Relativism denies that. Relativism says there is nothing universal. And in fact, relativism would argue that in one country human rights could be defined one way, but in another country they could be defined another way, and both would be okay. Both would be morally right. Because for a relativist, the only thing that makes something morally right are the laws and norms of the culture. So you could have, for instance, a culture that says, you know what, in our culture, human rights only apply to blonde-haired people, let's say. Only apply to blonde-haired people. And you have another culture where, let's say, human rights apply to everyone. Now, according to relativists, both cultures would be morally correct, and we'd actually be incorrect to judge this culture for only caring about blonde-haired people. Right? So it's really important to see that tension between saying that something's always true and saying that something's relative. If you believe that truth is relative, you can't believe in science fully. If you believe that truth is relative, you can't believe in objective scientific truth anyways. If you believe that truth is relative, you can't believe in universal values. They are not compatible beliefs by definition. So let's look at some more recent examples around the world. In our own country, we have the Black Lives Matter movement. This movement, of course, is based on the idea that everybody, including African Americans, have equal rights. Is it not? Okay, well then that can't be compatible with relativism. Because relativism would say, well no, equal rights are based on the culture, and if a culture wants to say that African Americans don't have rights, then that's okay. Right? That's what relativism says. It says whatever the culture believes is correct, is right, is true. Okay, so again, I want to keep emphasizing how important it is to understand relativism, to see the conflict here between an objective universal value and a relative value. They can't both be true, logically speaking. It's like saying there's a round square. It is not something that is possible. And what about when women got the right to drive in Saudi Arabia? Is that a good or bad thing? Well, some would say, hey, we can't judge another culture. If you're a relativist, you might say that. But a non-relativist would say, no, it's right for women to have rights regardless of the country. Right? We're not criticizing the culture, we're criticizing the practice, they might say. So anyways, I'm just showing you the different implications here of relativism and the different directions that this argument and the counter-arguments can go. So the one other thing I'd add is that I'll call attention to a thinker named Jonathan Haidt, who wrote a book called, I think it's called Righteous Mind, The Righteous Mind maybe, I'll throw it up on the screen, and basically in the book, Haidt went around to discover the way that people in different cultures think morally. And he actually lived in, I believe, an Indian Hindu culture for over a year himself to try to really get immersed. Don't quote me on that exactly, but something like that. He lived in the culture. And he also had a team with him, and he studied and got involved with many different cultures. And he was seeking to discover, are there any, what are the moral foundations of people around the world? Is there any universality here? And what he found is actually a pretty strong evidence, is pretty strong evidence against relativism. Because he found that every culture has these, I want to say it's 5 or 6 moral foundations. It's just that they're applied differently in different cultures. So for instance, the United States, we emphasize fairness, but it's not like Chinese people don't value fairness too. They just see fairness differently. But when you ask people in China or in the United States, they value fairness. They would be equally mad if somebody didn't get what they deserved for the work that they did, for example. It's just that the way the culture applies that value is different. So even with morality, like I said, relativism is just a hypothesis, and there's evidence on either side. Like I said before, there's evidence that there are differences between cultures, not denying that at all. But there's also evidence of similarities, right? And so, like I've said before, and I'll emphasize it again, if anything, the worst thing you can do with relativism is to assume that you know the answer already. Yep, it's all relative, dude, it's all relative. Like, without having really thought it through. You gotta think this idea through, and you gotta take on board the implications if you're really gonna address and understand the idea. Or you could do what the famous sophist I mentioned before, Protagoras, did. And that's, he said, hey, everything's probably relative, it doesn't really matter, let's just be practical. It's more or less what pragmatism is. Pragmatism assumes that we're relative. Assumes that everything's relative. The phrase that is often associated with Protagoras is, man is the measure of all things. In other words, every single value that we have or truth that we create comes from a human's mind. In other words, it's all relative. So because of that, said Protagoras, we might as well be practical. We might as well just go with the flow, because why ruffle people's feathers? Our lives will be easier if we just go along with the values that already exist. And I have the picture of Santa Claus there to just sort of point out, this is exactly what we do with kids and Santa Claus. We don't tell them when they're too young that Santa Claus doesn't exist, because we don't want to damage their perception of reality. And we're practical about it. We let them find out when they find out, or we tell them when we feel like it's the right time. But it's a very practical thing. We know it's not true that Santa Claus exists, but we let them believe it so that they can kind of feel the magic of being a kid like we felt when we were a kid. Right? That's more or less the gist behind Santa Claus. So, as it says there, there's only meaning to an idea if it's useful to us, if it helps us in our lives be happier. So it's practical in that sense. Now, there's another way that I often see people use pragmatism, and that's with religion, right? So if you're religious, you've probably felt and dealt with some challenges to your religion. That's pretty normal in a society like we live in today and with the internet at your disposal. And you may have thought to yourself that, yeah, maybe some of these challengers have some points and religions aren't perfect and there's been historical oppression and so forth. But you might have thought, you know what though? The religion works for me. I feel good when I go to church. I feel happy with my friends. I like talking about God. I like reading the Bible, or whatever religion it is. You might say, yeah, I get that there's some issues with religion, but it works for me and I'm not really concerned if everything's true. You may not be concerned with whether every single detail of the Bible is correct, and you don't care if it is. You just know it works. You just know it makes you happy. And that's a totally fair perspective to have. The one thing I'd say, though, is that if you do have that perspective, it's important to understand what you're saying. You're saying explicitly that your religion isn't necessarily true. You're saying it works for you personally. So that means you shouldn't also go around, if you're going to say your religion's practical for you, you shouldn't go around believing that yours is better, right? Going back to that culturally insensitive thing. You shouldn't go, and you certainly shouldn't go around saying and claiming that yours is true and others are not, or you certainly shouldn't go around ridiculing and claiming that other religions are false. So if you're going to say, in other words, that the religion is valuable and practical to you, you've given up all claims to truth. Right? You can't start talking about truth because you've replaced truth with practicality. And I already talked before about how this can backfire in the sense that what if you have a society where everyone's going with the flow, but there's some serious human rights violations and problems that need to be fixed? And I mentioned Martin Luther King before, but Nazi Germany would be obviously a great example as well. If everybody in Nazi Germany just said, oh, well, let's just go with the flow, it's going to take too much to go against Hitler, and right? And certainly many people did do that, which is why what happened happened. But anyways, I think I'm going to wrap it up there.